It was 11:23 on a Saturday morning at Cedar Grove Chapel when the lawyer stood up during William Harrison's funeral and said he had one final letter to read out loud. William had been dead for 5 days. Heart failure at 58. 300 people in attendance. His wife Catherine sat in the front row wearing black Chanel and a carefully composed expression of grief. Their 2 children, Emily and Nathan, sat beside her. I was in the back row by myself, where I'd been told to sit by the funeral director who'd called me 3 days ago and said William had left specific instructions that I be allowed to attend. The lawyer, a man named David Chen, cleared his throat and said, "William asked me to read this after the formal eulogy. It's addressed to my real family." Catherine looked confused. Then David started reading, and what came out of his mouth was 20 years of memories. Inside jokes, vacations we'd taken, quiet Sunday mornings, and private moments that defined William's actual life. Every single word was about me. Not Catherine, not his children. Me. And everyone in that chapel was about to discover that the widow in the front row had been living with a ghost, while William's real life happened 60 miles away in a different city with a different woman. I'm Rachel Morrison. I'm 47 years old, and I'd been William Harrison's partner for 20 years when he died. Not girlfriend, not mistress. Partner. That's what he'd always called me. William was married to Catherine for 33 years. They had Emily, who was 31, and Nathan, who was 28. William owned a consulting firm, business strategy for tech companies. He traveled constantly for work. Seattle to San Francisco to Portland to Denver. That's what Catherine thought, that William was always traveling for business. And he was traveling, but not always for business. He was traveling to see me. I lived in Portland, Oregon. William lived with Catherine in Seattle. Every 2 weeks, William would come to Portland for what Catherine thought were client meetings. He'd stay for 3 or 4 days. We'd have dinners. We'd go hiking. We'd stay in my apartment that he'd helped me buy. We'd live like a normal couple for those few days. Then he'd go back to Seattle and back to being Catherine's husband. For 20 years, we'd lived this way. William and I met in 2005 at a conference in San Francisco. He'd been a speaker. I'd been attending for my job as a project manager at a software company. We'd gotten coffee after his panel. We talked for 3 hours about everything except work. At the end, he'd said he was married, but that his marriage was complicated. That he and Catherine had an arrangement. That they stayed together for the kids and for appearances, but that they lived separate emotional lives. I'd heard that before from other men, but William had been different. He'd been honest. He'd said, "I can't offer you marriage. I can't offer you a public relationship. But I can offer you honesty and consistency and a real partnership, even if it's not the traditional kind." I'd been 37 and divorced and tired of dating men who made promises they never kept. William's honesty had felt like a gift, so I'd said yes. For 20 years, we'd built something real. We'd had traditions. Every Thanksgiving, William would tell Catherine he had to work. He'd come to Portland, and we'd cook dinner together. Just us. Turkey and all the sides. We'd watch football and fall asleep on the couch. Every Christmas, William would spend the actual holiday with Catherine and the kids. Then, December 26th through New Year's, he'd come to Portland and we'd have our own celebration. We'd exchange gifts. We'd go to the coast and rent a cabin. We'd start the new year together. Every summer, William would tell Catherine he had a week-long conference. He'd come to Portland and we'd drive to Crater Lake or the Oregon coast or up to the San Juan Islands. We'd hike and kayak and sit by fires and talk about everything. We'd built a life in the margins of his other life, and it had felt real. It had felt like enough. William had always said that when the kids were grown and settled, he'd leave Catherine. That he'd waited this long because divorce would have destroyed Emily and Nathan when they were younger. That he'd needed to wait until they were adults who could understand. Emily had graduated college in 2018. Nathan had graduated in 2021. Both were working and living independently by 2022. I'd asked William when he was going to file for divorce. He'd said soon. He'd said he was working on it. He'd said he needed to get his finances in order. He'd said he needed to prepare Catherine. He'd kept saying soon, and I'd kept believing him. Because I'd wanted to believe him. Because after 20 years, Walking away would have meant admitting I'd wasted 2 decades waiting for something that was never going to happen. Then William had died. Heart failure. Sudden. He'd been at home in Seattle. Catherine had called 911. He'd been gone before the ambulance arrived. I'd found out from David Chen, William's lawyer, who'd called me 3 hours after William died. David had said, "I'm calling because William left instructions. You need to know he's gone. And you need to know that he left something for you." I'd asked what. David had said, "A letter, to be read at his funeral, in front of everyone." I'd asked why. David had said, "Because William wanted the truth to come out. He was tired of lying. He wanted everyone to know about you and about the life you'd built together." I'd said, "That's going to destroy Catherine." David had said, "William knew that. He said it was time for the truth." I'd wanted to not go to the funeral. I'd wanted to stay in Portland and grieve privately. But David had said William's instructions were clear. I had to be there. The letter couldn't be read unless I was present. So I'd driven to Seattle. I'd worn black. I'd sat in the back row of Cedar Grove Chapel. I'd watched Catherine and Emily and Nathan sit in the front row looking devastated. I'd listened to people talk about William, about what a devoted husband he'd been, what a loving father, what a successful businessman, what a pillar of the community. Every word had felt like a lie, not because William wasn't those things to some degree, but because none of those people knew who William actually was. They knew the performance. I'd known the person. David Chen had stood up after the formal eulogy. He'd said he had one final letter from William, that William had asked him to read it out loud, that it was important. Catherine had nodded like she'd expected this. Like maybe William had written her a final love letter. David had opened an envelope. He'd started reading. The letter had begun. To my real family. Catherine's face had changed. Confusion, then concern. David had kept reading. The letter said, "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And if David is reading this out loud at my funeral like I asked him to, then you're about to learn the truth about the last 20 years of my life. Catherine, Emily, Nathan, I'm sorry you have to hear this in public, but I couldn't die with this secret. I need you to know who I really was and where my heart actually lived." David had paused. The chapel had been silent. Catherine had looked like she'd wanted to interrupt but didn't know what to say. David had continued. The letter said, "In 2005, I met a woman named Rachel Morrison at a conference in San Francisco. We started a relationship that lasted 20 years. She lives in Portland. For the last 2 decades, most of my trips to Portland weren't for work. They were to see her. We built a life together. A real life. With traditions and routines and love that sustained me through years when I felt like I was suffocating in Seattle. Rachel, you're in the back row right now. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for loving me without needing public acknowledgement. Thank you for being my actual partner even when I couldn't give you the title." Catherine had made a sound. Not quite a gasp. Not quite a sob. Something between the two. Emily had grabbed her mother's hand. Nathan had turned around to look at me. His face had been a mixture of shock and anger. David had kept reading. He'd read about Thanksgiving dinners William and I had cooked together. About Christmas weeks we'd spent at the coast. About summer trips to Crater Lake. About quiet Sunday mornings in my apartment drinking coffee and reading newspapers. About inside jokes. About books we'd both loved. About movies we'd watched a dozen times. About conversations that lasted until 3 a.m. About the life we'd built in stolen days and borrowed time. The letter had said, "Catherine, you and I stopped being partners 25 years ago. We became roommates. We became co-parents. We became business associates managing a household and a social life. But we stopped being people who loved each other as individuals. We stopped having real conversations. We stopped being curious about each other. We performed marriage for the kids and for appearances, but we weren't actually married in any meaningful way. You know that. You've known it for years. You just didn't want to acknowledge it because the performance was comfortable." Catherine had stood up at that point. Her face had been red. She'd said, "I don't have to listen to this." David had said, "Actually, William's will stipulates that this letter must be read in its entirety. If you leave now, certain provisions of the estate become contested." Catherine had frozen. Her lawyer had leaned over and whispered something. Catherine had sat back down, but she'd been shaking. David had continued reading. The letter had said, "Emily and Nathan, I love you both. I always have. But I need you to understand that being your father wasn't the only thing that defined me. I needed to be more than just dad. More than just Catherine's husband. More than just the guy who ran a consulting firm. I needed to be William, the person, the individual. With Rachel, I got to be that. With Rachel, I was funny and thoughtful and creative. I was someone who hiked and cooked and talked about philosophy and books and ideas. I was someone who felt alive instead of just functional. Your mother gave me a family and a life of stability. Rachel gave me a life of meaning." Emily had started crying. Nathan had stood up and walked out. Catherine had looked like she'd wanted to follow him, but couldn't move. The chapel had been so quiet you could hear people breathing. David had kept reading. He'd read about specific moments. A trip William and I took to Bend, Oregon, where we'd gone rock climbing, and he'd told me he'd never felt freer. A night in Portland when we'd stayed up talking about what we'd do if we could start over. And he'd said he'd choose exactly this. A morning after Thanksgiving when we'd walked through my neighborhood, and he'd held my hand and said this felt more like home than anywhere else. David had read about dreams William had shared with me. About wanting to retire early and travel. About wanting to write a book. About wanting to live somewhere quiet near the ocean. All dreams he'd apparently never shared with Catherine. The letter had described me. It had said, "Rachel is patient in ways I never deserved. She waited 20 years for me to be brave enough to choose her publicly. I never was. I kept saying soon. I kept saying after the kids were grown. I kept making excuses. The truth is, I was a coward. I was comfortable in Seattle. I was comfortable with the performance of marriage. I was too afraid to blow up my life even though my real life was in Portland. Rachel deserved better than that. She deserved someone who'd claim her publicly, who'd introduce her as his partner without hesitation, who'd build a life with her that didn't require secrecy. I couldn't give her that, but she stayed anyway. That's love. Real love. The kind that asks for nothing and gives everything. Catherine had been crying now. Silently. Tears running down her face. Emily had her arm around her mother. People in the chapel had been shifting uncomfortably. Some had left quietly, but most had stayed. Curious. Shocked. Unable to look away from this public dismantling of Catherine Harrison's perfect life. David had read the ending of the letter. It had said, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not apologizing for loving Rachel. That's the best thing I ever did. I'm just stating facts. For 20 years, my heart lived in Portland with a woman who knew me better than anyone, who loved me without conditions, who built a life with me in the margins and never complained that she deserved the center. Catherine, you were my wife legally, but Rachel was my partner actually, and everyone here deserves to know that." The letter had ended with specific instructions about the estate. William had left Catherine the house in Seattle and half of his retirement accounts. He'd left Emily and Nathan trust funds, and he'd left me the other half of his retirement accounts plus a house he'd bought in Cannon Beach, Oregon, that I'd never known existed. A house he'd apparently bought 3 years ago and had been furnishing for us. For the life he'd kept saying we'd have soon. The letter had included the address. It had said, "Rachel, the house on Hemlock Street in Cannon Beach is yours. I bought it imagining our life there. I'm sorry I never got to live it with you, but I want you to have it. I want you to have the life we planned even if I can't be there for it." David had finished reading. He'd folded the letter. He'd said, "That completes William's final statement." He'd sat down. The chapel had been silent for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Then Catherine had stood up. She'd looked at me for the first time. She'd said, "You ruined my life." I'd said, "I loved him." She'd said, "You destroyed my marriage." I'd said, "Your marriage was already destroyed." He told me you'd had separate bedrooms for 15 years, that you barely spoke except about logistics, that you'd built a life of performance. She'd said, "That's a lie." I'd said, "Is it? When was the last time you and William had a real conversation? When was the last time you talked about something other than kids or money or schedule? When was the last time you knew what he was thinking or feeling?" Catherine had opened her mouth, then closed it. She'd had no answer. Emily had said, "My dad loved my mom." I'd said, "He may have loved the idea of her, the mother of his children, the person who made his social life work, but he didn't love her as a person. Not the way he loved me. Not the way he talked about books and ideas and dreams with me." Emily had said, "You're a homewrecker." I'd said, "I'm the woman your father chose. Every day for 20 years. He chose me. Not publicly. Not in ways that cost him anything, but privately, when it mattered, he chose me." Emily had looked at her mother. Catherine had looked devastated. They'd left together, walking out of the chapel while people stared. After the funeral, David had pulled me aside. He'd handed me keys and documents, the deed to the house in Cannon Beach, account information for the retirement funds, everything William had left me. David had said he wanted you to know he meant it. All of it. The letter, the house, everything. He said he'd spent 20 years being too afraid to choose you publicly, but he wanted his final act to be choosing you completely. I'd asked if Catherine would fight it. David had said she might try, but the will is ironclad. William updated it 3 months ago. He knew what he was doing. He was of sound mind. Everything is legal and documented. She can contest it, but she won't win. I'd driven to Cannon Beach the next day. The house had been on Hemlock Street, 2 blocks from the ocean. A small craftsman-style cottage. 2 bedrooms, open kitchen and living room. Big windows facing west toward the water. William had furnished it. Comfortable couch, dining table, books on shelves. He'd stocked the kitchen with cookware and dishes. He'd hung pictures on the walls. Not pictures of us, just landscapes and art he knew I'd like. He'd made it a home. Our home. The one he'd been planning to move into with me. The one he'd kept saying we'd live in soon. I'd sat on the couch and cried for 3 hours, grateful for the house. Devastated that William wasn't there. Angry that he'd waited too long. That he'd died before we'd gotten to live the life he'd promised. Over the next month, I'd gotten calls from Emily and Nathan. Emily had called to yell at me. She'd said I'd destroyed her parents' marriage, that I was a selfish person who'd ruined her family, that she'd never forgive me. I'd listened. I hadn't argued. At the end, I'd said, "Your father made his choices. I didn't force him into anything. I gave him a place to be himself. If that destroyed your family, maybe your family was already broken." She'd hung up on me. Nathan had called 2 weeks later. He'd been calmer. He'd said, "I need to understand. Did my dad really love you?" I'd said, "Yes, he did." Nathan had said, "Did he love us?" I'd said, "Of course he loved you, but loving you didn't mean he had to stay in a marriage that made him unhappy." Nathan had said, "I think I always knew something was off, that my parents were just going through motions. I just didn't want to believe it." I'd said, "Your dad tried to make it work for your sake. He stayed longer than he probably should have, because he didn't want to hurt you." Nathan had said, "And now he's hurt all of us anyway." I'd said, "Yeah, he did." Catherine had hired a lawyer to contest the will. The challenge had lasted 4 months. Her argument had been that William wasn't of sound mind when he'd updated his will, that he'd been unduly influenced by me, that 20 years of secrecy proved I'd been manipulating him. Her lawyer had presented the case to a judge. David had presented documentation showing William had been examined by a doctor 3 months before his death and found to be in perfect mental health, that William had written the letter himself, that William had bought the Cannon Beach house years ago with his own money from accounts Catherine had never had access to, that everything William had done was deliberate and legally sound. The judge had dismissed Catherine's challenge. He'd said William Harrison was clearly a man who'd lived a double life by choice, and who'd made legal provisions to reflect his actual wishes rather than societal expectations. The will had stood. Today, 2 years later, I'm 49 years old, and I live in the house on Hemlock Street in Cannon Beach full-time. I retired early using the money William left me. I spend my days reading and hiking and sitting on the beach watching waves. It's the life William said we'd have, the quiet life near the ocean. The life he'd dreamed about but never got to live. Emily hasn't spoken to me since her phone call. Nathan sends me a Christmas card every year. Short messages. I hope you're doing well. Dad would be happy you're living in the house. Nothing more than that. But it's something. Catherine sold the house in Seattle and moved to California to be near her sister. I heard she tells people she's William's widow, and that he died suddenly before they could retire together. She doesn't mention me. She doesn't mention the letter. She's rewritten history to be more comfortable. I understand that. It's easier to live with. I think about the funeral sometimes. About David standing up and reading that letter in front of 300 people. About Catherine's face when she realized her marriage had been a performance. About Emily and Nathan, learning their father had a whole other life they'd never known about. About the way nobody followed Catherine when she walked out, how they'd all stayed to hear the rest of the letter, how William's truth had been more compelling than Catherine's grief. That says something. About what people knew or suspected. About how many of them had seen through the performance of William and Catherine's marriage. About how the truth, even uncomfortable truth, is what people want to hear. The letter William wrote wasn't an apology. It wasn't asking for forgiveness. It was just facts. This is who I was. This is where I lived emotionally. This is the woman I loved. This is the life I wanted. Take it or leave it. That takes courage. Even in death. Especially in death when you're not there to face the consequences. William had finally done what he'd never done in life. He'd chosen me publicly. He'd claimed our relationship in front of everyone. He'd told the truth about where his heart had been for 20 years. It had destroyed Catherine's image. It had shattered his kids' understanding of their family. It had exposed secrets that probably should have stayed secret, but it had also validated 20 years of my life. 20 years of being the woman nobody knew about. The secret partner. The hidden relationship. William's letter had said, she mattered. She was real. What we had was real. And that matters to me even now, 2 years later. Living in the house William bought for a future we never got to have together. Was it selfish of William to write that letter? Probably. It would have been kinder to let Catherine keep her illusions. To let Emily and Nathan remember their father as a devoted family man. To let me grieve privately without becoming the public homewrecker. But William had been tired of lies. He'd spent 33 years lying to Catherine about his feelings, 20 years lying to me about when he'd leave, his whole adult life lying to everyone about who he actually was. The letter had been his final act of honesty. His way of saying, this is the truth. I'm done pretending. And while it had hurt people, it had also freed them. Catherine could stop performing perfect wife. Emily and Nathan could stop pretending their family had been functional, and I could stop being a secret. We could all live in reality instead of comfortable fiction. That's worth something, even if it's painful. The house in Cannon Beach is exactly what William promised. Quiet, peaceful, beautiful. I watch sunsets from the porch every evening. I walk on the beach every morning. I read books William and I talked about reading together. I cook meals William and I planned to cook. I live the life we'd dreamed about for 20 years. Without him. That's the tragedy. That's the price of William waiting too long. Of him saying soon for 2 decades. We'd finally gotten everything we wanted. The house. The freedom. The ability to be public. And William wasn't there to share it. The letter at his funeral had given me vindication. But vindication doesn't keep you warm at night. Doesn't sit across from you at dinner. Doesn't hold your hand on beach walks. I'd trade every word of that letter for 1 more year with William in this house living the life we'd planned. But I don't get that choice. I get the house and the money and the public acknowledgement and the memories. I get to be the woman William loved. The real family he wrote about, but I have to be that alone. And that's the real story. Not the dramatic funeral letter, but the quiet years after. Living in a house bought for 2, alone, making peace with being chosen but not having the person who chose you.